Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're diving into a really monumental puzzle, one that has absolutely fascinated economists, historians, and tech nerds for well over a century. I want you to imagine, just for a second, trying to run an entire nation's economy. Like we're talking allocating every single ounce of steel, deciding how many loaves of bread get baked, and then getting all of that out to millions of people, but doing it without ever using market prices. It sounds crazy, right? How would you even know what's valuable? How would you figure out what's scarce? Well, this debate over whether a centrally planned economy could actually work was literally one of the most intense intellectual clashes of the 20th century. And as we're going to see, it is surprisingly, almost shockingly relevant today.
So I want to pose this question directly to you. How on earth do you price 22 million completely distinct goods without a market to tell you what they're actually worth? If you don't have buyers and sellers organically negotiating a price based on supply and demand, how does some central authority figure out the relative value of, say, a massive tractor versus a single ton of coal? And look, this isn't just some fun theoretical brain teaser. This was the exact, seemingly impossible logistical nightmare that real central planners faced when they tried to engineer a fully planned system from the top down.
Okay, let's dive right into this scale. 22 million. That is the truly staggering number the Soviet government eventually took on. To completely wipe out the free market, they had to sit down and manually manage 22 million individual prices. Plus, they had to handle 460,000 distinct wage rates and over 90 million work quotas for their population. That's enough data to make your head spin. The sheer volume of information required to replace the organic, decentralized choices of a regular market economy is honestly almost beyond human comprehension. But here's the kicker. Long before they actually tried to do this in practice, economists were already battling it out over whether it was even theoretically possible.
Section 1. The Economic Calculation Problem. The Austrian School's Challenge.
So the historical origins of this whole debate kick off back in 1920 with an Austrian economist named Ludwig von Mises. The Bolsheviks had just taken power in Russia, and the concept of state socialism was catching fire worldwide. But Mises, he stepped right up to challenge the fundamental core of how a socialist economy would even function. See, in a market economy, prices act like little signals. They reflect scarcity, and they pull together super dispersed information from millions of people about what they want and what it costs to actually make it. But in a fully planned economy, the state owns all the means of production, right? The factories, the mines, the land, the whole shebang. Because there's no private property changing hands, there are no actual market prices for those capital goods. Mises essentially pointed out that without these prices, central planners are basically flying blind. They have absolutely no objective way to calculate production costs, compare different methods, or efficiently hand out resources.
And Mises definitely didn't mince words here. He wasn't just saying state socialism would be, a little less efficient than capitalism. He was arguing that without that price mechanism, it was fundamentally 100% impossible. He put it bluntly, without economic calculation, there can be no economy. Socialism is the abolition of rational economy. So according to Mises, without money acting as a real-time expression of price for all those raw materials and labor, planners would just be groping in the dark, and that would lead to inevitable, absolute chaos.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Socialist Rebuttal, Simulating the Market.
Now, the intellectuals pushing for state planning, they obviously didn't just roll over and accept Mises's critique. A fierce counter-argument sprang up from neoclassical and Marxian economists. They believed this calculation problem wasn't some fatal flaw, but really just a giant math problem that could be solved. So, on one side, you've got the Austrian school with Mises and later on Friedrich Hayek, insisting rational calculation is just impossible without organic prices. But on the flip side, thinkers like Oscar Lange and Abba Lerner pitched this idea of market socialism. Lange argued that a central planning board could essentially act like a simulated market using a trial-and-error method. Think of it like this. If they set a price for a good and noticed they had a mountain of unsold inventory piling up, they'd just lower that administrative price. If there were massive shortages, they'd hike it up. They really believed they could artificially replicate that market clearing mechanism just by tweaking the math.
All right, Section 3, Gosplan's Impossible Math, the reality of Soviet central planning.
Moving away from all that high-level economic theory in the 1920s and 30s and into the messy, ground-level historical reality, we've got to look at the Soviet Union's Central Planning Agency, Gosplan. This was the giant bureaucracy actually assigned the task of making all this math work for an entire nation. Since they couldn't rely on prices to organize production, Gosplan came up with what they called the method of material balances. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale we're talking about. They built these massive physical balance sheets for thousands of individual commodities. They'd look at the inputs needed, tons of coal, iron ore, human labor, and try to perfectly match those up against the national targets for outputs, like steel and tractors. They were literally trying to replace the entire invisible hand of the market by manually matching national supply with national demand on thousands of giant interconnected spreadsheets.
But as you can probably guess, the reality of managing millions of variables manually was just crushing. Just listen to this incredibly dark-humored quip from Soviet economist Nikolai Fedorenko. He said that a fully balanced, checked, and detailed economic plan for the next year would be ready, with the help of computers, in 30,000 years. 30,000 years. The informational bottleneck was just insurmountable, because decisions were coming from all these different, often conflicting corners of the bureaucracy, and because the math was infinitely complex, the plans ended up being neither balanced nor really all that rational. And the real-world consequences of this calculation problem? Yeah, they were severe. We see this theoretical friction turning into chronic, everyday imbalances and just massive systemic waste. To put that into perspective, the Soviet Union would literally have situations where brand new tractors were just sitting out there rusting in fields of unharvested grain. And why? Because the central plan for producing those tractors wasn't perfectly synced up with the plan for refining tractor fuel, or allocating the right mechanics to maintain them, or even building the garages to house them. It's like a giant puzzle where half the pieces are from a different box. The rigid system just could not adapt to dynamic, on-the-ground realities.
Section 4. The second economy, the shadow market emerges.
So what actually happens when a heavily rigid official command system fails to give people basic consumer goods or handle the simple complexities of daily life? Well, human nature adapts. It always does. An entirely new, shadow system organically grew to fill the giant gaps left by the central planners. And this brings us to a super crucial cultural concept in the Soviet Union known as blat. Blat was basically this sprawling, complex network of favors, influence, and informal exchange. If the central plan didn't give you the spare parts you needed to fix your factory's machine or the medicine you desperately needed for your kid, you couldn't just go to a store and buy it. You had to use blat. You traded favors. It was a massive, underground second economy operating right alongside and honestly often completely against the official state plan. For a lot of folks, it was literally the only way things actually got done. Eventually, Western analysts studying the Soviet system really caught on to the jaw-dropping scale of this shadow market. There was this fascinating study done by Rand and UCLA that dug into the phenomenon, and they found a massive disconnect. As time went on, the legal income citizens were supposedly earning completely decoupled from what they were actually out there spending and saving. Think about that for a second. This huge statistical gap proved the massive corruption-fueled growth of the black market. That rigid top-down plan was slowly being completely hollowed out by an informal, unplannable market living right beneath its surface.
All right, Section 5, Planning in the Digital Age, Algorithms and Mega Corporations.
Now, I want to pull the rug out from under you just a little bit here. We've spent all this time talking about the historical failures of planning, but why does this matter today? Well, let's pull this century-old debate right into the 21st century, where the technology we have is, frankly, playing a totally different sport. Modern economists and authors, like the folks who wrote The People's Republic of Walmart, they argue that this calculation problem, it might not be unsolvable anymore. They point straight to modern tech, big data, networked digital feedback loops, and of course, artificial intelligence. They make the case that modern multinational megacorporations, think Walmart or Amazon, are already operating as highly sophisticated, centrally planned economies. They aren't using internal market prices to move a product from an Amazon warehouse to a distribution center. They are using algorithmic planning, insane amounts of data collection, and direct computation. They are basically doing exactly what Gosplan tried to do, but with tech the Soviets couldn't have even comprehended in their wildest dreams. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is just looking at the monumental shift from 1928 to today. You've got Gosplan's human bureaucrats taking months upon months to use literal paper balances just to track maybe 20,000 broad commodity groups, slowly inching toward a rigid plan. Now compare that to the megacorps of today. They're using big data and AI feedback loops to instantaneously manage billions of individual products across fully global, algorithmic supply chains in real time. Modern computing power and predictive AI have so dramatically shifted the parameters of Ludwig von Mises's original 1920s debate. The sheer raw computational force we have today makes the idea of calculation in kind, meaning doing it all without money, theoretically plausible on a scale we've never seen before.
Which leaves us with this final really provocative thought. Have big data and AI actually finally solved the economic calculation problem? As our tech just keeps advancing at breakneck speed, could the future of the global economy honestly rely on the exact kind of centralized, algorithmically driven planning that the Austrian economists swore was absolutely impossible a century ago?
It is such a wild question, one that totally bridges the gap between our past and our highly digital future. And for sure, it's something we are all going to be watching unfold in the years to come. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning how the systems around you really work.